Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that the entire, not through careful committee hearings, but through a single late-night proclamation that most people still don't fully understand. I am talking about what happened last week, and I need to tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. Most people, including some very smart people I know, have absolutely no idea what is actually about to happen over the next 6 to 12 months. And the gap between what they think is happening and what is really happening could determine the future of this country for the next decade. Let me start with what we know happened. On November 27th, just after Thanksgiving, 2 National Guard members were killed in an ambush-style shooting near Washington 600. One of them, Sarah Beckham, was only 20 years old. She volunteered to work on Thanksgiving. She wanted to serve her country. And within 48 hours of that tragedy, President Trump released what he is calling the most significant immigration directive of his presidency. He announced a permanent pause on migration from what he termed poorer nations and third world countries. He called for something he is labeling reverse migration, meaning not just stopping new arrivals, but actively removing people who are already here. He promised to end federal benefits for non-citizens, to denaturalize people he considers threats, and to deport anyone deemed, and I am quoting here, non-compatible with Western civilization. Now, I want you to think about that for a second, from an engineering perspective, because that is how I look at everything. When you are building a rocket, you can't just announce that gravity no longer applies. You can't declare that physics will bend to your will. You have to work within the constraints of reality. The same principle applies here. The question isn't whether Trump's proclamation sounds dramatic, or whether it fires up his base, or whether it terrifies his opponents. The question is, what can actually be implemented versus what is political theater? And I think the answer to that question is far more complex and far more interesting than what you are hearing from either side right now. Let's start with the legal reality, because this matters more than the political rhetoric. The president has significant authority over immigration. That is true. The Supreme Court has consistently held that border control and national security give the executive branch wide latitude. We saw this with the travel ban in Trump's first term. Courts initially blocked it, but the Supreme Court ultimately upheld a revised version. So Trump has real power here. But here is what most people miss. That power has limits. And those limits become very sharp very quickly when you start talking about people who are already in the country legally. Denaturalization, which means stripping citizenship from naturalized Americans, is extraordinarily difficult. You need to prove fraud in the original application. You need court proceedings. You need evidence. You can't just declare that someone who criticizes America or holds views you don't like should lose their citizenship. That is not how the law works, no matter how much anyone wishes it did. I've built companies in multiple countries. I understand regulatory systems. And what I can tell you is that the gap between announcing a policy and implementing it is where most ambitious plans die. Trump announced this permanent pause, but what does that actually mean operationally? Does it mean 0 visas issued from certain countries? Does it mean pausing refugee resettlement? Does it mean ending temporary protected status? Each of those requires different legal mechanisms, different administrative processes, and different levels of congressional involvement. And here is the thing that keeps me up at night thinking about this. The American legal system, whether you like it or not, moves slowly on purpose. That is a feature, not a bug. It is designed to prevent exactly this kind of sweeping overnight change. Within hours of Trump's proclamation, the ACLU announced lawsuits. Immigration advocacy groups filed emergency injunctions. Blue state attorneys general issued statements promising to fight this in court. And this is where it gets really interesting from a systems perspective. You have to understand that American immigration policy isn't just federal law. It is a complex interaction between federal authority, state implementation, court oversight, and international agreements. When Trump says he is going to deport people who are public charges or security risks, he is probably on solid legal ground for non-citizens who entered illegally. But when he starts talking about denaturalizing citizens or removing people who entered legally years ago under different administrations, he is walking into a legal minefield that will take years to navigate. Let me give you a concrete example of why this matters for ordinary people, especially seniors watching this. Right now, there are an estimated 50 million foreign-born people living in the United States. That number includes citizens, green card holders, visa holders, and yes, people here illegally. Trump's proclamation suggests that a significant portion of these people could be subject to removal or loss of benefits. But think about what that means practically. Where do you house people while their cases are being processed? How do you conduct millions of hearings with an immigration court system that is already backlogged for years? Who pays for the detention facilities, the judges, the legal representation? And most importantly, what happens to communities, businesses, and social services that depend on this population? I am not making a moral argument here. I am making an engineering argument. Systems have capacity constraints. You can't just declare that the system will process 10 times its normal workload without building that capacity first. And building that capacity costs money, requires congressional approval, and takes time. This is why I think the real story over the next 6 to 12 months won't be mass deportations or widespread denaturalization. The real story will be a grinding legal and administrative battle over what can actually be done within the constraints of the Constitution, existing law, and physical reality. Now let's talk about what this means for different groups of Americans, because this is where the proclamation stops being abstract and starts affecting real lives. If you are a senior citizen on a fixed income, and you've been watching your community change rapidly over the past decade, you might support this policy because you see it as finally addressing problems that politicians have ignored. Hospital wait times have gotten longer. Schools are more crowded. Housing costs have risen partly because demand has outpaced supply. These are real, tangible impacts that people feel every day. Trump's argument is that by reducing the immigrant population and redirecting federal benefits away from non-citizens, resources will be freed up for American citizens. That makes intuitive sense. Less demand on services should mean better service for those who remain. But here is where the engineering analysis gets complicated. Let's say Trump succeeds in removing 1 million people over the next year, which would be an enormous administrative achievement. What happens to the labor markets those people were participating in? What happens to the Social Security taxes they were paying? What happens to the businesses that employed them? Economic systems are interconnected in ways that make simple cause and effect very difficult. You can't just remove a large chunk of the population and expect everything else to remain constant. Some effects will be positive, some will be disruptive, and many will be unpredictable. I think about this the same way I think about supply chains at Tesla or SpaceX. When we source components from multiple countries, we build redundancy into the system, because we know that any single source can fail. The American economy has become similarly dependent on immigrant labor in certain sectors. Agriculture, construction, food service, healthcare, support. These industries have structured themselves around the availability of immigrant workers, both legal and illegal. If you suddenly remove a significant portion of that workforce, those industries don't just snap back to employing native-born Americans at the same wages. They restructure, automate, or in some cases, collapse. And that restructuring has consequences that ripple through the entire economy. Here is what I think is really happening beneath the surface of this proclamation. Trump is making a bet that the American public, especially his base, cares more about symbolic action on immigration than they care about the economic disruptions that might follow. He is betting that the courts will allow enough of his agenda to proceed that he can claim victory. And he is betting that blue states and sanctuary cities will overreach in their resistance, creating a political backlash that helps Republicans in the midterms. These are all political calculations, not policy calculations, and that is fine. Politics is about power and perception. But if you are trying to understand what will actually happen to your life, your community, and your country, you need to separate the political theater from the operational reality. Let me talk about the blue state response, because this is where the federal system creates a natural check on executive power. Governors in California, New York, Illinois, and other blue states have already announced that they will not cooperate with federal immigration enforcement beyond what the law requires. Sanctuary cities have policies that prohibit local police from asking about immigration status or holding people for ICE without a warrant. Trump has threatened to cut federal funding to these cities and states, but that threat has its own legal limits. The Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government can't coercively commandeer state and local resources. You can't force a local sheriff to do ICE's job. So what you are going to see over the next year is a kind of slow-motion constitutional standoff. Federal immigration agents will increase enforcement in blue states. Local governments will refuse to help and will actively obstruct in some cases. Legal challenges will wind through the courts. And in the meantime, millions of people will be living in legal limbo, not knowing if they'll be allowed to stay or forced to leave. This uncertainty is itself a policy outcome. It creates fear and compliance, even without mass deportations actually happening. From an engineering standpoint, this is an incredibly inefficient way to run a system. Uncertainty destroys investment, planning, and social cohesion. But from a political standpoint, it might be exactly what Trump wants. If people self-deport out of fear, he achieves his goal without the cost and legal battles of forced removal. If businesses stop hiring undocumented workers out of fear of raids, he achieves labor market tightening without changing the law. Fear is a tool, and it is being deployed strategically here. Now, I want to address something that is going to make some people uncomfortable. Is there any merit to the underlying concern that Trump is responding to? Let's be honest about this. The 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan was chaotic. People were brought to the United States on evacuation flights with minimal vetting. Some of those people may pose security risks. We don't know how many because the vetting that should have happened didn't happen in the rush to get people out. That is a documented failure of process. Similarly, when you have sustained high levels of immigration, both legal and illegal, without corresponding investment in integration services, education, and social infrastructure, you create strain. That strain is real. People experience it in their daily lives. The question is whether Trump's proclamation is a proportional and effective response to those real problems. And here is where I think the engineering analysis really matters. If the problem is inadequate vetting, the solution is better vetting systems, not blanket bans. If the problem is strain on social services, the solution is increased investment in those services or controlled immigration levels, not sudden mass removal. If the problem is security threats from specific individuals, the solution is targeted law enforcement, not collective punishment of entire national origin groups. Trump's approach is a hammer when what is needed is a scalpel. And that is not because he is stupid or evil. It is because he is optimizing for political impact, not policy outcomes. Let me tell you what I think is going to happen over the next 6 months based on how systems actually work. Courts will block the most extreme parts of the proclamation. Trump will revise and narrow the orders to survive legal challenge. Immigration enforcement will increase, but not to the levels being threatened. Some people will be deported, particularly those with criminal records or outstanding removal orders. Many more will remain in legal uncertainty. Blue states will resist and create legal safe harbors. Red states will cooperate enthusiastically, and the national debate will be bitter, divisive, and largely disconnected from the actual policy being implemented on the ground. Here's what this means for you. Personally, if you are a senior citizen trying to make sense of this, your Social Security isn't going to suddenly improve because immigrants are removed. The wait list at your hospital isn't going to disappear overnight. Housing costs might moderate slightly in some markets, but they're driven more by zoning laws and interest rates than immigration. The real impact you are going to feel is social and political. Your community might become more polarized. Your family might have arguments at dinner about this, and you are going to be bombarded with messaging from both sides, trying to convince you that either America is being saved or America is being destroyed. My advice, and I say this as someone who thinks about systems for a living, is to be skeptical of grand proclamations from any side. Focus on what actually happens, not what people say will happen. Watch court decisions, watch implementation timelines, watch actual deportation numbers versus rhetoric, and ask yourself whether the changes you see in your community over the next year match the promises or threats you are hearing today. The truth is that immigration is one of those issues where the gap between political rhetoric and policy reality is enormous. Both sides exaggerate. Both sides use fear. Both sides promise simple solutions to complex problems. Trump's permanent pause sounds dramatic and decisive, but when you look at the legal constraints, the administrative capacity, the economic interconnections, and the federal system's built-in resistance to rapid change, what you're actually going to see is something much messier, slower, and less dramatic than either the hopes of his supporters or the fears of his opponents. Here is my final thought, and this is where I want you to really think critically. What if the goal of this proclamation isn't actually to implement everything it says? What if the goal is to shift the Overton window, to make previously unthinkable policies seem reasonable by comparison, to energize a political base, and to force opponents to defend positions that are unpopular with swing voters? That would be a very sophisticated political strategy, and it would explain why the proclamation is written in such extreme terms, even though much of it probably can't be implemented as written. I am not saying that is definitely what is happening. I am saying you need to consider that possibility when you are trying to understand what comes next. Politics is theater. Policy is engineering, and the two are often only loosely related. Over the next 6 to 12 months, pay attention to the engineering, the actual implementation, the court decisions, the budget allocations, the administrative actions, because that is where reality lives. The theater will be dramatic and emotional and will dominate the news cycle. But the engineering will determine what actually changes in your life and your country. So here is my question for you, and I want you to really think about this. If you could choose between dramatic symbolic action that makes you feel like something is finally being done versus slower, less dramatic policy changes that actually work within constitutional and practical constraints, which would you choose? Because that choice, whether you realize it or not, is what you are actually being asked to make. And your answer to that question will shape not just immigration policy, but the future of how America governs itself. Think about it. Leave your answer in the comments. And if you found this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to be tracking exactly what happens as this policy unfolds over the coming months. Reality doesn't care about rhetoric, and neither should you.